So when I compare the women in Rwanda and the women in Kenya, I'm going to say that they're vastly different.
Focus, man.
What's good, everybody? This is your guy, Jay Focus, reminding you to stay focused. And today we're going to compare two of the East African standouts. So on one end, we have Kenya, Nairobi, you got Mombasa, you've got Kisumu, and then on the other side, you have Rwanda. You got Kigali, you got Gisenyi, and you've got some other smaller cities. So first off, I want to say I enjoyed my time in both countries. I've recently been in both areas, so I know them very well. This is coming from a Black American's perspective, somebody who's traveled all over the world. So I'm going to try and be as unbiased as possible. I don't have a dog in this fight. I'm actually a fan of both cities, and I would like to see both cities prosper and do big things going forward. And they're already doing very big things and would serve a lot of people in the diaspora who would like to relocate to the continent of Africa. Now that I got that out the way, let's strap ourselves in and we're going to get into it. So straight up off the back, I'm going to talk about food because it may not seem like it. I'm on the skinny side, but a brother likes to eat. And I will say that the Caribbean food in Rwanda was superior to the Caribbean food in Kenya. It was actually very hard for me to find Caribbean food in Kenya. And I looked very, very hard all over Nairobi, looked on Google, asked around. I had a hard time finding it. I found one or two places, and what they considered Caribbean food just was not authentic. Now, this may be an opportunity for somebody listening who comes from the islands and can bring that kind of food to Nairobi. Please, please do, because I didn't see any. And like I said, I looked around. Now, in Rwanda, I actually did not have any trouble to find Caribbean food. There are two very solid restaurants there that do Caribbean food. I actually have done videos on each place, so I'm not going to rehash it. If you want to see those videos, you're going to Kigali, you want some of that Caribbean vibe, some of that Caribbean flavor, check those out before you go. But I will say that the food was just that much better, the Caribbean stuff in Rwanda versus in Kenya. Now, I know people are like, who cares about Caribbean food? You're in East Africa. You should be eating the local food. Now, I have eaten the local food, but I like Caribbean food, and I'm going to eat it anywhere in the world. I was eating Caribbean food when I was in Berlin, okay? So this is important to me, and this may be important to some other people in the diaspora who are looking to relocate to Africa, or East Africa in particular. Now, when you compare the transportation systems in each country and each city, capital city, in Kigali and in Rwanda in general, you have the motorcycle taxi system. So this is the most common way for locals to get around. Basically, all of the motorcycles that will offer rides will wear a red vest, and they have an additional motorcycle helmet for you to put on to be protected during the ride. And this system works actually pretty well. They have an app that is linked up to them, but you can also just hail them off the street with GPS. And the rides are really cheap. It's usually going to cost you about 75 cents to $1 at most to move throughout Kigali, right? Now, for the people who don't want to ride motorcycles, which I ain't mad at you. I don't like to ride motorcycles all the time, especially if I'm not the one driving. So you're probably curious about what the transportation system is as far as taxis. So this is when it isn't so good. In Kigali, they have one app. It's called Yego. There is no Uber in Rwanda, and there probably never will be. I think that they want to protect the local market, so they want you to use a local app, which I would not have a problem with if the app was a little bit more functional. So that's something that they can work towards in the future. But as of today, when I'm making this video, the app has a lot of room for improvement. So for example, in Uber, when you call in a taxi in Uber to come to where you're at, you can see on the map live updates as the car is moving towards you. Now with the app that they use in Rwanda, Yego, the app will display the car where they're at when you first accept the ride, but then after that, you get no updates. So you don't know if he's 10 minutes away, 5 minutes away, if he's stuck in traffic. There's no way to see that on the app. So unfortunately, you have to constantly call them or go back and forth or just wait. And if time is of the essence, if you have somewhere you need to be at a certain time, this can be extremely frustrating. And a lot of the Uber drivers, Uber, but the Yego drivers, the ones who drive the taxis, they do not speak English, and many of them cannot read a map. So it's going to be very hard for you to get around the city, especially when you don't know the city. They barely know the city, at least on a map. So navigating things is not smooth. Now, I'm going to contrast that with Kenya, Nairobi in particular, but everywhere in Kenya, there is Uber, the big cities. In Kenya, they actually can follow the map. It's surprising, but communication is also going to be a lot easier because everyone speaks English in Kenya to some level, and typically it's going to be a higher level than what you're going to find in Rwanda. So Uber will work just like it works wherever country you're coming from, America, Canada, UK, etc. You dial in, where you're trying to go, they show up. Usually not a problem. They may call you just to confirm, but that's it. They will show up. You can see the updates and you can get where you're going. And the price is actually cheaper in Kenya using Uber than it is in Rwanda using their version of Uber. And this really surprised me because Kigali is a smaller city than Nairobi is, but it is what it is. That's how things work out. It's a little bit more expensive. I don't know if that's due to the fuel prices being higher, but rides were cheaper for me in Kenya. The traffic is a little bit worse in Nairobi than it is in Kigali, just a little bit. You do get some kind of a backup and rush hour traffic in Kigali, but it clears out a little bit faster than it does in Nairobi. And I don't know if that's due to the fact that there's so many motorcycles that it keeps the cars off the road, but it is what it is. Now, when I compare the personalities of the people you're going to encounter in Rwanda versus Kenya, the people in Rwanda tend to be a lot more shy. And this could be due to language skills in English, or a lot of it is also culture. So what you will notice about Rwandans is they're going to be very polite, and they may not express themselves, especially when they initially meet you. One thing I've noticed in Rwanda is that it can be very hard to read people and they can come off as shy. And like I said, some of that could be language barrier, but they're typically not going to communicate any more than is necessary unless you really pull it out of them. So if you're more of an extroverted person and you're able to pull conversations out of people, then you won't have as much trouble. But if that's not who you are, then you may struggle a little bit in Rwanda, where in Kenya, like I said, people speak English, and I found that they're a little bit more open to conversation with someone that they've just met. I feel like they don't have as much of a poker face, and you can read them. If they're annoyed, you can see it. If they're happy, you can see it. If they're neutral, you can see it. Where with Rwandans, they hold those emotions a little bit closer to their chest at times. I also find that Rwandans can be occasionally passive aggressive, and you may not notice it at first because it's subtle. Whereas Kenyans, if they're displeased, they're much more likely to show it to you. Of course, not in as aggressive a way as, say, someone from New York or someone from the US. So they are going to express themselves and get their point across in a much more direct manner than you're likely to encounter in Rwanda. You can see a lot of elements of English, British culture still within Kenyans. They are big drinkers like their brethren over in the UK, and they kind of have a rowdiness about them when they drink, kind of like their brethren in the UK. I also noticed that in Kenya, you see a lot more smokers, cigarette smokers, than you do in Rwanda. I don't know why that is in particular. Perhaps it's because in Rwanda, cleanliness is a high priority there, and they don't want people throwing cigarette butts around. So to be honest, I didn't even see any cigarettes for sale when I was in Rwanda. And for me, this is a big positive. I'm not a fan of smoking, and especially not people smoking cigarettes indoors. And in a lot of countries, when you get outside of the West, they still allow people to smoke cigarettes indoors. So you're really not going to encounter this much in Rwanda, whereas in Kenya, I wouldn't say a lot of people smoke, but you're going to see it a lot more frequently than you do in Rwanda. So when I compare the women in Rwanda and the women in Kenya, I'm going to say that they're vastly different. The women in Rwanda, like all people in Rwanda, tend to be more shy, less likely to show emotion, especially when they first meet you. They're not going to give you their full personality range. It may take you a while to really feel like you understand this person and where they're coming from. Whereas in Kenya, I feel like you get that within the first 2 minutes, maybe even sooner than that. And some people are going to prefer Kenyan style, and some are going to prefer the Rwandan style. I will say that the Rwandan women also tend to be a bit quieter. Now, I'm not saying that they don't talk, that they don't express themselves. They definitely do, but they tend to speak at a softer volume when they speak. And I don't know if that's because English for them is maybe a second, third, fourth language, but in Kenya, you're not going to get that. The women are going to speak more or less at a normal tone that we're used to in the States, and they're going to know a lot more about American culture and slang, for better or worse. So if you like that, it's going to be much more familiar when you're dealing with a Kenyan woman in Kenya than it is if you're dealing with a Rwandan woman in Rwanda. If you're coming directly from a Western culture, there's going to be less of a gap between you in Kenya 9 times out of 10. Another thing that's unique about Kenyan women is they are not shy when it comes to giving compliments. So Kenyan women, if they see something about your appearance, the way you look, they like your shirt, they like your hat, they like your hair, what have you, they will not be shy about letting you know. And this is a little bit more similar to American culture, where if we see something, we say it. Hey, I like your tie. Oh, that's a dope dress. Oh, you get your hair done? Like that kind of a thing is very common in American culture, where in Rwanda, I'm not going to say it never happens, but it kind of goes along with what I said, with them being more shy and being more reserved. They may notice something and maybe they have the thought, but that thought doesn't always get expressed as freely as it does in Kenya. So comparing Kigali with Nairobi. Now, Nairobi is a massive city. It's very big, spread out. You can spend several months in Nairobi without seeing the entire city. And a full disclaimer, I have not seen the whole city. It is very big, but I tried my best to see as many neighborhoods as possible. I even went into Eastleigh, which is more or less the Somalian neighborhood in Nairobi, and I have a video on my channel, which you'll get to see that as well. So I really didn't just stay in a bubble. I didn't just stay in Westlands. I moved around, y'all. I got all over the city, and that is one appealing thing about Nairobi, is that you don't feel like, okay, I've been there, I've seen it all, I've done it all. There's always something new to see. There's new corners to turn, and there's a lot of variety in the city. Now, what Kigali has going for it, it's a much smaller city than Nairobi, and the population is smaller, but oh my God, it is gorgeous. I never get tired of saying this. I probably say this on every video I do on Kigali, and hopefully you can see the beauty in some of my videos. I try to capture as much as I can, but you really have to be here to see it, to breathe the air, to see the greenery everywhere, the rolling hills. There's just no comparison that I've seen in East Africa to the sheer beauty, cleanliness, and the feeling that you get when you're in Kigali, Rwanda. When it comes to safety between Kigali and Nairobi, it's been said many, many times that Kigali is safe, and I'm gonna say it one more time. Kigali is safe. I felt like anything bad that happens to you in Kigali, it's your fault, because security there is good. There's a high police presence, but not an overwhelming presence where you've got guys, just walking around with machine guns. It's not on that level. And I've had many situations where people have gone out their way to guide me when I was lost. As I said, I have no complaints when it comes to safety in Kigali. Now, Nairobi, nothing bad happened to me in Nairobi either, but just the fact that it's a much larger city, it's more diverse, and things are a little bit less regulated. I would say that Nairobi is not quite as safe as Kigali, but in either city, things are going to be fine. If you're coming from the West, things are much worse in the States or Canada or UK than anything you're going to encounter in either city. So don't be paranoid about safety in either city. We got to talk about housing. So in both cities, I was blown away with the level of comfort, the Western style luxuries and amenities that we've grown accustomed to are very easy to find in either city. In Nairobi, you're spoiled for options as far as where to stay and what prices you're going to pay. And more or less, Kigali is a little bit more limited just because, as I've said, it's a smaller city, but you'll have no trouble finding a very nice place, Western standard, Wi-Fi, power doesn't go out, everything is more or less new, hot water works when it's supposed to work. These kind of things that we take for granted in the States, you can take them for granted in Kigali for the most part as well. You're not going to have a hard time to find these kinds of amenities. So when it comes to value for money in Kigali and Nairobi, it's so close. It's super close. What I paid for housing in Kigali and what I paid for housing in Nairobi was almost exactly the same. It might have been $15 difference. So it's so negligible, it's not even worth talking about. And the quality, the value was the same. Very, very nice in either city. The amount that I paid for my gym in Kigali and the amount that I paid in Nairobi was very similar. Kigali was a little bit cheaper, but it's not a big deal when you compare the difference. Now, when it came to costs for transportation, Ubers, etc., as I said before, if you want to move around on a motorcycle all day, then Kigali is going to win by a long shot. If you're comparing like to like, moving around in taxis, moving around in buses, matatus, or the public bus that they have in Kigali, it's very similar. It's going to be a little bit more expensive, I believe, in Kigali if you're going to ride in taxis, but it's not that big of a difference. So if we're comparing moving around in Uber in Nairobi versus Yego in Rwanda, it's going to be a little bit more expensive in Kigali, but it's not that much. So maybe a typical ride might cost $6, $7 in Rwanda. In Nairobi, it might be around $4 to $5. So it really depends how many trips you're going to be taking and the distance that you're going to travel. When it came to services like grooming, getting your beard done, getting your hair cut, your braids, dreads done, whatever, between Nairobi and Kigali, Kigali was a little bit cheaper, but we're talking about just a few dollars. Going through, adding up all the categories, food prices, grooming, housing, transportation, across the board between both countries, it's very, very similar. It may be a little bit cheaper in Kigali for some things and a little bit cheaper in Nairobi for other things. But in general, the prices are very similar. And in either country, I feel like the value for money is extremely good. So with that being said, I love both countries. If you want to visit both. Go ahead, like the video while you're thinking about it. And until next time, this is your guy, Jay Focus, reminding you to stay focused.
This thing is a life that's better than your
Focus, man.